society. So they're no longer protecting the roads on our streets. Well, of course that would be important, but mainly on our streets themselves. Because we must know our officers. Because if we do not, then there is simply no respect. Thank you.
Yeah, on the streets, not in the social media like they are.
Of course, of course. Hello there.
I mean, can I ask you about, you know, that gentleman before was talking about London?
Yes.
The Metropolitan Police have built up a bit of a reputation for brutality, and especially against black people, people like Stephen Lawrence, Mark Duggan. Could you talk a bit about maybe you talk about getting to know our policemen better. Is there a way?
Racism.
Is there? Yeah. What can we do? Say for example, if we're not white Londoners, is there how do you overcome that maybe sense of distrust?
Do you think diversify the police?
Well, I think it's very important that we get police officers from all aspects of society, because at the end of the day, we're all Londoners, and we want, you know, every person from London to be respecting their police officers. So you need someone from every background, every group, for example. And I think it's very important that they're not, you know, other than certain groups, your police officers should be, you have to remember that they're civilians in uniform police officers, so they shouldn't be armed unless there's special groups dealing with terrorism, of course. We have to put them on a level with our, you know, civilians and think, you know, we're all the same, we all want to work together to live happily, so let's try and respect the police as best we can.
Do you think only certain people can be police officers? So like really tall, big, strong men?
Certainly not. I think.
So you think even like a 5 foot girl can be just eligible as a policeman, you know?
I believe they can, yeah, I think there's
don't you think
perhaps
that
you can have certain individual groups, perhaps, of special task force, I don't know,
So do you think she could take down a 6 foot, you know, guy?
Well, that, I don't know, she's
You
probably
don't
more
know.
trained
We
than I would
have
be.
video evidence so many times of the girl police officers being
perhaps
completely
in that
dominated
case,
by
you
one
would have special
man.
units perhaps that would deal with, you know, if they've been told that this incident has occurred, then they might send a more specialist team perhaps.
But the more this happens, the more the police is going to be a laughing stock, you know?
Of course, and we've got to try and make the police back on a well-respected level.
So
Can I ask another question?
Get the right officers.
You know, I just wanted to point out another story. You mentioned, you know, you started your narrative, your background, historical background in the sort of early 19th century. But I think it's worth keeping in mind in the late 18th century, this idea of policemen was considered very un-English, very un-British. The idea of having people coming and telling you what to do, and you know, you used to have a magistrate who you'd go to if you had a problem with, say, crime or whatever. You know, there wouldn't be a uniformed, you know, institute of the state walking around. I mean, in terms of being a part of our national identity, you say you want us to respect the police more, but if they are kind of a bit maybe alien to our British history, they're only relatively recent, the last couple hundred years.
Yeah.
Then how do you get respect for them if they're not?
Well, as I say, currently we see the police, since the institution of, you know, they are on our roads, so they protect the roads. We have no idea who's behind that wheel. We have to introduce them back into the community aspect. So, you know, before, if you did something wrong, your father or your mother would know the police officer and you'd be in trouble with them as well. Now it's a case of, you know, we don't actually know them, and it's just, there's massive divides. Bringing them back onto our level, we'll see the community aspect restored.
How do we bring them back?
And how do you bring them back? Well, that is a very good question, and I think perhaps the way to do that would be, at the moment we've got community support officers now. I'm not entirely sure what their role is, but they sort of play the more, you know, the old police role, which they walk about the streets, and they tend to be the butt of jokes now. But we need to change that. We need to put the real police into these roles that they take, because that way they'd have a lot more respect, because we get to know them. Because we know our community support officers. We have no idea about who the police are unless they're in the car.
Do you know most people don't even know that you can elect your local, not constable, but there's a police commissioner. That's the one. Thank you.
Yeah, I didn't know that myself.
So you're giving a speech about the police, and yet it's the government maybe needs to publicise that.
Of course.
The fact that you're more likely to take the time to get to know your bobbies if you actually are electing your major commissioner.
Police commissioner, 12% of the electorate who could vote for police commissioners voted for police.
Only 12%. There you go.
12%.
Well,
Out of how many thousands, millions of people?
out of 100%.
Well, in that case, certainly it needs to be encouraged that this can be, voted for, so that people are aware, and then that way, the community aspect will still.
Maybe you could introduce some kind of reform for the complaints procedure as well. A lot of people fed up with the Scotland Yard because it's very difficult to make a complaint, get it through to the top. If you think there's been corruption going on, or racism or brutality, it's much hard. It's actually surprisingly difficult, I think, to get redress. I don't know if you've ever read a book called The Untouchables it's by two ex-Guardian journalists, and they go into detail about some really dodgy dealings. In the 1980s, there was a heist called the Brinks Mat heist, it was the biggest heist in British history. It was billions of pounds worth of gold bullion, and there's very good evidence to believe the police were actually involved in facilitating that heist. Because they're actually not really given that much oversight by the public, or the Home Office. I think it's the Home Office who run the police. And there isn't that proper complaints procedure. They often do internal investigations rather than get. So maybe we should have some kind of outside investigators come in if there's a problem.
Perhaps there should be some reform in that area. I think the government needs to look at how the police is at the moment, compare it to how it was previously. Because
sometimes it's very
with the institution of the police,
I would like to talk about
there was a rising violence at the time as well. So perhaps we were to perhaps even temporarily restore the old system, just to see how the levels go for a few years,
I think
and
the
then if
problem
it
with
was
the
a
police
complete
is that
failure,
the
then
police
bring it back.
So what about, have you considered this problem of funding? People like Jeremy Corbyn want to put they say that we need 10,000 more police in London. Is that not part of it as well?
Police are not the issue here.
They're not.
They're not the issue here because the real issue is the respect for the police because we have no idea who they are. So the reality is that we need to get them back to the community because police cuts, of course, are terrible, and the police need more money. But that does not mean, let's say they should be completely the laughingstock that they are today. Bring them back into the community. It may even reduce manpower because you'll have to reduce all the, the communications, etc. And then you'll have the police back in our streets, so we'll know them, and that way we should get a better system.
Much of the money, the additional money, that they cry out for is in fact spent on palatial officers and ever more powerful cars. Policemen, individual policemen themselves, although they say, we must get them back on the streets, go along with it.
Yeah, it's true.
Because they like it, because it's exciting.
Do you remember, you're as well, but you have to keep in mind as well, there's cuts to other services that affect the police. So for example, if you cut the NHS, which the Tories have been doing since David Cameron's Health and Social Care Act.
No, we haven't. We've increased it.
Since 2012 or 11, I believe it was one of those years, the Health and Social Care Act opened up the NHS to privatisation.
Do you even know what the Health and Social Care Act entails?
It actually effectively abolished the National Health Service.
Yeah, he doesn't even know what it entails. He can't even cite how it organisationally restructured the NHS.
What it did was it got rid of the government's commitment to providing public health service. Now what happens is that affects the police, because if I need an ambulance and it's not coming fast enough, I'm going to call a police officer.
How the reforms affected the NHS.
You're going to call a police officer. You're going to call a police car that might get you to the and police stations are increasingly doing that. I'm sorry, but if you even read the Guardian, the Sunday Times, mainstream newspapers,
so impartial.
if you prefer the Sunday Times, you can read about that in the Tory press as well. You'll find that the police are being increasingly relied on to do things that they're not supposed to do, like getting people to hospitals, because the NHS is being cut. So I think cuts, maybe not to the police, but you have to take into account cuts to the NHS.
Oh yeah, cuts do certainly affect it, but I don't believe in the police itself it's the main cause for the lack of respect.
Yeah, but on that note,
this guy believes that you can't put a village mentality on an urban environment.
Of course you can. Neighbourhoods. They're called neighbourhoods. It's like a little village.
Yeah, neighbourhood what?
Do you reckon it's viable that all the Londoners know all the police are?
Yeah, do you know that sorry, can I say something?
Of course, yeah.
The police actually have a structure. They do things by wards. So within each borough, they have special ward units that are specific for each particular section. Yeah, I mean, and also, so Speakeasy Corner, because it's a hotspot for certain ideas getting spread out. I mean, you have undercover. You definitely have special branch people here undercover, and you definitely have. I mean, I know Steve. You should chat to Steve if he's around today. He can tell you about this.
I'd like to make a little remark on the note of police doing some things that they shouldn't have. I have the best example for me of police. It's not even police brutality. I honestly look. Police is a bit rough sometimes here in London, but I don't think it's very brutal.
You're from Ukraine, okay? It's gonna seem by comparison.
Well, compared to every country I've been to,
yeah, it seems nice here because you're from a place where the police are.
Fair enough. You know, but look, my point is, I think the big problem with the police here in the UK and in London is that police are policing thoughts. They are on the media. They're on the media. They're policing
social media intelligence.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's really useless.
That is the worst thing.
That's more GCHQ.
It's a huge waste of tax
No,
money.
it isn't. It's the police are effectively surveilling what people say on Twitter. It is
policing what people think, what people say on Facebook. Come on, man. They are banning Facebook trolls because they are making jokes.
Of course.
I mean,
personally, I prefer
The thing about police is they have a weird sense of humour. I have a friend who is an ex-London policeman, and this guy is not he's not actually deep down, he's a nice man, but his sense of humour is strange, it's immature. And it delights in suffering.
That's exactly how I think about the police, except that they have the power to actually ban you from Facebook.
So what do you do about all the bent detectives? What do you do about all the bent detectives? I mean, apparently in the 90s there was a guy called Condon. I think he was actually the chief of the police at the time.
There was a guy
so there were up to 250 bent cops in London.
For making yourself do a
more like 250,000.
It's not even that many police, but
Operation Country.
Well, here's a question: what incentives do police officers have? They want, like any person, they want to climb the corporate career ladder, and usually in the police, you often do that by maximising the number of arrests. Now, unfortunately, you can't do that by trying to retrieve somebody's phone and arresting the individual who robbed that phone. A very easy way of trying to increase your arrest record is by simply policing what somebody said on Twitter and who became offended as a result of it.
It's now taking up to 5 hours for one arrest to take place. So if a police officer wants to arrest one person for petty crime, then it can take up to 5 hours to manage that person, to get them into the cells, etc. What's the incentive, indeed?
One thing that every now and then they come out with a thing about so many people rung the police about this, about stupid things. What they can't understand is that when that person rung in, that thing was the most important thing in the world for that person.
Yes.
Such as how to get a prescription, such as how to get this stuff. And it's pathetic for the police to ridicule such people, because such people do exist. Then you get the type of person who rings about 5 times a day, every day. You know, it's obviously a top problem, of course. You know, but they must try to understand the public a bit more and not mock. Well, I mean, out of interest, I haven't been back here for years, but when I used to come here in the 80s, earlier, they used to sort of throw a bloke out, and then we would say to them, well, throw him out, but don't laugh afterwards. And then you see them on television, and they're standing in between some terrible tragedy, and you get, you know, I'll be on the 9 o'clock news. That's the attitude. It's the maturity of some of these people is a little bit like, to say the least.
But honestly, for me, the worst thing is that they're policing hate speech. And what is hate speech? It's completely open to interpretation. You can call anything hate speech nowadays, and you can frame a person for that. That's basically totalitarianism, because you can call whoever person you don't like, whoever person is undesirable by the state. They can say, oh, he practices hate speech, or he causes trouble. Let's frame him. That's it. The guy doesn't get to say anything.
I think as well we got to do proper investigations into history as well. I mean, the Brazilian electrician who got killed was at Stockwell Tube, I believe. We need to look into David Norris. That still hasn't been really fully dealt with. Stephen Lawrence, all kinds of cases that I think, because Britain is, it's not like the United States publishes a lot of files. Actually happened in these places.
The murder of the Brazilian is running the police.
Yeah, you want the police to be respected, right?
Yes.
That's your main aim today. You want us all to respect the police.
Indeed, yes.
Sure. You gotta tell us how, and you've got to, I think, maybe encourage us to look at the history of Scotland. I mean, there's all these like. Do you mind? Sorry, okay, thank you very much for speaking. Do you mind if I get up and speak? Or do you want to keep speaking? Or
No, it's fine. If you want to speak. Thank you.
Yeah, but that doesn't mean to accept
Thank you very much, Oliver, for telling us about the police.
Thanks, Oliver.
Say a round of applause. Thank you. I'd like to tell. About a month ago, I got arrested, and I was in a police cell for 5 hours.
You were in the newspaper, weren't you?
Incredibly well, and I really respect them for that. They did a really good job. I still have some marks on my wrist from the handcuffs, it was quite painful. But what I did to get into that prison, I think, was well worth the discomfort of having my day disrupted. What did I do to get into prison? Essentially, I was a police cell for 5 hours. I was at Croydon Custody Suite. 5 hours, from about 1:30 till 7 in the afternoon. I helped to blockade a bridge. I've told you about this, you already know about this. I worked with a group called Extinction Rebellion. For five bridges going over London, I was on Lambeth Bridge. We did a sit-down, or sit-in, whatever you want to call it. There was about 100 of us on each bridge, I believe, and about 40 of us got arrested in total. I was one of those 40. It says in the newspapers 88 got arrested, but it was actually less than that. It was about 40. Now, there are many cases where it is important to defy the police.
About the place where you
places where public safety is at risk. So the issue of climate change, that needs to go on the agenda. That needs to be on the spotlight, and it needs to be discussed. We need to deal with that. It's more important than a particular bridge being open or closed. And so my intention for taking part in that was to raise the issue of climate change as part of this organisation, Extinction Rebellion, with 3 demands. We have first of all, we demand that the British government tells the British public the seriousness of climate change using the mainstream media. It's the first demand. Second demand is to reduce carbon emissions to 0 by 2025. And third demand is to create a national assembly, representative of the British public, of a few thousand people to oversee this change, from the current oil-based economy to a green economy that will actually take us into the future. Acts of civil disobedience, police prepare for them. They have special squads that actually deal with them. If you're an environmentalist activist as well, you're almost definitely being surveilled by either Special Branch, MI5 or GCHQ. But the thing is, after a certain point, ladies and gentlemen, I have to tell you, you don't care about these things anymore. You just stop. You don't want to get up onto the rooftops and shout about these things. You don't mind being. You don't want to be secret anymore. You don't want to. I was proud to give them my name, my details at the police station. Well, it wasn't a police station, the custody suite in Croydon. I was proud to give them my details. Yeah, tell them about that. Sorry?
You're on a database now.
I'm on a database.
Why did they take you to Croydon?
It's not a police station. It's
that was worse. That's the custody suite.
No, Croydon's fine.
Otherwise known as a police station.
But this gentleman Oliver's right, though, to an extent, about the difficult relationship London has had with the Met.
You were still up there.
There is incredibly
Since
the late 90s, there has been a lot of decline in trust of the police, and that's gone in hand. That I think began when John Major started to bring bonuses to policemen. Performance-related pay. I think when you bring in performance-related pay for everything, especially a job that requires creative thinking, like being a policeman, I think you start to see a decline. The reason you join the police is not to get money. It shouldn't be about performance-related pay. The reason you join the police is to serve the public. You know, when I was in the police van being driven down to Croydon with about 5 other activists, one of the activists asked the policeman, "Why did you become a policeman?" And he said, "To help people. To help people." It's as simple as that. That's what it should be about, right? It shouldn't be about, "Oh, I want a stable job," or "I want this kind of money," or it should be about helping other people. That's really what Bobby should be there for. And you know, I look forward. Sorry, yeah, go on.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. The election of all police.
I don't think we should elect all police. There are I think 20,000 police in London just by itself, so you can't elect all of them. But maybe we could create a system where local neighbourhoods choose their police. Yes. So you know, you have like a squad. You know, each neighbourhood in London, there's about 600 neighbourhoods in London or so, and you would have each one choose its squad, a specific squad specifically for that neighbourhood. And then eventually, if we get to a more crime-free society, if we start to reduce the reasons for crime, which lie in poverty, for the most part, if we start to reduce those crimes and reduce that poverty, we might even look to a time when we don't really need so many police officers, and we don't need such a big budget for the police. They don't need armoured cars or any weapons or anything like that. We can start to have we can go back to a more medieval idea. The medieval forerunner of the police was the watch, the town watch. These were just ordinary citizens who would walk around the town at the middle of the night and see what was going on. You know, that would be a more. But I think we're looking towards a more utopian type of London here, where you could have maybe a rotation of police officers. It could be a more amateur job rather than a professional job.
Can I run this one now? There've been some people in this proud, I'm sorry to use that word, who would have done jury service. I've never been asked for some reason. You've never yet been asked for what, maybe in the next maybe years. What about a thing like that, please?
Yeah, maybe jury service.
The
thing is, it does require
something. Maybe
it does require a certain
in
level
your
of
life.
physicality. I think to be a policeman does require physical strength. Even if you're a woman, a police woman, it requires sort of physical training.
But obviously within
I think you do it to be a certain age, so I think it does require that. But now I'm going to move on to the second part of my speech, or I'm actually going to start a new speech. It's going to relate back to the police, but not really. So my name is Kyle Farron. Like I said before, I'm part of Extinction Rebellion, and I was arrested with a bunch of other activists on Lambeth Bridge a few weeks ago. I'm now planning for this Tuesday another action, but this time it's not going to be civil disobedience. We're here looking at a very, the aim is more persuasion and it's more a symbolic act. The demonstration will start outside the Tate Modern, where there's just been an exhibition put out of melting ice blocks from Scandinavia. I don't know if any of you have read in the newspapers, but
does it exist?
It might have melted already. Yeah. If it's melted already, that's still fine. The demonstration will start at 3 p.m. this Tuesday. Excuse me.
Sorry.
At 3 p.m. this Tuesday outside the Tate, the front entrance of the Tate, and we'll walk along the riverbank or that area of the Thames. We'll walk along until we get to City Hall, where we will hand a letter of support to Sadiq Khan for his recent climate. He's just declared a climate emergency, ladies and gentlemen. So the Mayor of London has just declared a climate emergency. That shows you where we are today in the world. That the level of, even mainstream political parties are now starting to get their act together and recognise the seriousness of the problem.
Isn't climate change just part of life? I mean, look at the Ice Age. That was
there's two ways you can use the words climate change. You can use them in the way that most people use them, which is to talk about the very recent changes since the 19th century related to industrialization, burning fossil fuels, trapping heat in the atmosphere to create the greenhouse effect, which then warms up the climate, disrupts weather patterns, and now creates extreme weather. That's what most people talk about when they talk about climate change, right? Then there's the other kind of climate change which scientists use to define a specific era, such as Ice Age or a particular time going back. I'm more interested in the first kind. I'm talking here about the recent changes. Thanks to companies like British Petroleum, ExxonMobil, Shell, when they burn oil and they burn fossil fuels, they're pumping CO2 into the atmosphere, which then drives the heating of the atmosphere, disrupts weather patterns. Even places like London. London is very sheltered from rising sea levels because we're in an estuary that's quite inland. It's not really a port city, London, although it's sometimes described as one. It's actually quite inland. We'll be protected for a long time. But cities like Mumbai, cities like Manhattan, which are on islands right by the sea, I really fear for those people who live on those islands. You think Hurricane Sandy was bad? And you think the typhoons that swept over the western seaboard of India were bad 10 years ago, 15 years ago? We're in for something very devastating unless we get our act together and trust in the power of collective action. This gentleman, Oliver, just got up to speak about how we should respect the police more. And I basically agree with him. I basically think we should respect the police more. We should also respect the power of collective action. Oliver spoke about communities working together to make a more safer neighbourhood. Communities where your police officer face to face. He's not just a faceless uniform driving along the street, which you barely know. He's actually someone who walks down the pavement and you can bump into and ask how the day is going, right? Now, we can build up, if we trust in the power of communities, local communities, collective action, we can really bring about change. So that's why I'm asking all of you to come to that demo. It shouldn't be a gigantic affair, but it should be interesting. There'll be music, leaflets. I think someone's going to bring a big art piece of an iceberg to bring along with us. And you might even see Sadiq Khan if he's there, and if he agrees to our invitation to meet him in the lobby. It should be interesting. So I'm going to finish my speech there. Thank you very much for listening. Are there any other questions? Thank you. Any questions?
Would you accept that a sort of ideological move towards green energy, especially within the time frame of 2025, would bump up energy prices enormously and impact the poorest in society?
Yes, that was my question.
I don't think that's necessarily the case. I mean, for example, during World War II, there was price controls. We're talking here about something in World War II. Climate change is a far bigger threat than the
Pretty
Nazis.
drastic.
If you actually look at, it's very interesting. If you look at newspapers from the 30s and 40s, for obvious reasons, it was on the front pages every single day. The build-up to the war itself, and the aftermath. That was endlessly discussed. If you think about it, climate change is a far bigger threat than the Nazis. Climate change threatens to destroy the prospects for a decent life on this planet. It's a far bigger threat than the Nazis. The Nazis were a small, well, relatively small party in Germany that rose to become a big party, but again in a small country that could be contained by the outside world. But if you look at something like the Republican Party in the United States, they're far more dangerous than the Nazis today. The Republican Party is they're cutting back research into renewable energies. They're giving endless subsidies to fossil fuel. People like David Cameron as well, very dangerous, saying when he said things like, we should cut the green crap. You know, this is, if you want your children, if you want you to have a good life in England, if you want to have the decent things that make for a modern life, an acceptable standard of living. I mean, it's like James Lovelock said this, the biologist. Civilization is not about Michelangelo and the Sistine Chapel and Dostoevsky. That's part of civilization, but that's not really. If you look at what civilization really is, it's people living together decently, in a decent way, like we're doing now. Most of you are complete strangers. I've never met you, but we're having a conversation, a discussion in public. We're investigating the truth of a situation. That's what civilization is. I fear that if we don't deal with climate change, we're going to have a disintegration of this kind of behaviour. We're going to see something more like Cormac McCarthy's The Road, where you have gangs of warlords trailing through stateless anarchy, and things like women's rights will go out the window, and you'll go back to kind of a tribal mentality again. It'll be kind of another Stone Age. I'm not trying to fearmonger because I don't believe that's a very good way to bring us forward. But we really, instead of acting out of fear, we should act out of real love for the human species. Real love for all the animals that are perishing in England. I believe it was 1 out of 10 species now have gone extinct.
No, excuse me. I've got to
I'll take your question and his question afterwards. Right. Sorry, no, other way around. His question and then yours.
Sorry, I'm not going to let you get away on that one.
Just on the question of commodity prices.
Sorry.
The basic reason why there is huge amount of pollution and global warming and climate changes in the world is because of the overproduction of the capitalist system. The capitalist system produces far too much, and in the process, I'm sorry, but that is the fact. The fact is, because of the capitalist production, the process of overproduction of commodities produces pollution. Now, your case about production of commodities, prices going up, is totally unnecessary. Commodities can be kept lower than ever by producing only what is required by human needs. That means a real cutback on all of this massive overproduction. I mean, look at the question of cars, for instance.
You know what we need to solve it? Socialism.
Your thing about species.
Laugh.
Sorry,
prove me wrong. Prove me wrong.
I can prove you wrong. Okay, let's wait for that.
Of the global warming has increased by 15%. Because things have got warmer, those things survive. In fact, even the beloved Caroline Lucas said, we didn't say it was all down.
It depends on what species.
I said we do as
so
good
for example, badgers might come back in Britain. Yes. Badgers require a slightly warmer climate. The hedgehogs are going to go very much slightly. If we don't do something about climate change and damage grassland and so on in London and England, then hedgehogs might go extinct. It depends on the species. Foxes might do well, and then other species might do badly.
Foxes do very well.
But I want to go back to what my comrade said.
They're pretty well off.
This is completely right. It's a specific kind of capitalism. We do not live in the capitalism of Robert Peel. In the time of Robert Peel, 1822, capitalism was almost completely curtailed by the state. There was heavy levels of protectionism. So, for example, when Britain was trading with India, India was producing, actually at the time, I believe, much more superior forms of warships because they were based on teak wood rather than oak wood. So they're actually better, they lasted longer. So the British shipbuilding industry was under threat, so they brought in massive protection to curtail capitalism, curtail the market. Now, you also saw in some ways it was actually more free as well. You had children working in factories. Nowadays, capitalism has been restrained, so the children can't work in factories, they have to go to school. But nowadays we live in a form of capitalism which is not really based so much on direct imperial intervention by the British state. We live in a time when it's corporations, the big companies, And if you trust the Canadian legal scholar Joel Bakken, who's written a very fantastic book about what he calls the corporation, the institutional form that it takes. He's not so interested in criticizing a particular company like BP or ExxonMobil. He's looking more at the form of it. He comes to the conclusion that corporations are essentially psychopathic. They essentially have no. If you listed all their main features and what they're legally mandated to do, what they're legally mandated to do by the government of the United States and by Britain and Japan as well, increasingly, what they're legally mandated to do is to provide maximum returns to their shareholders. That is their legal mandate. If they don't produce profits, they're breaking the law. This is the way. This is the way the system is set up. Now corporations have to compete with each other. They have to compete for that market share so they can maximize returns to their shareholders. If they don't, then they go out of business. It's a grow or die economy. Grow or die. And the problem is with this market system and the corporations that play in it, the market system doesn't have any sense of community. It's not based on any sense of knowing your local policemen or knowing your local business people. It's not primarily about that. It can be, and it maybe was 150 years ago, but it's not today. The market system is incredibly dangerous because it externalizes. Corporations are like sharks. They have a specific mentality which you can't alter. They have to externalize all their problems. For example, a car manufacturing business, they want to sell as many cars as possible to maximize the investments that are put into them by their shareholders. They cannot afford to think about problems like traffic, pollution, all the problems that are killing Londoners. I believe pollution kills about 9,500 Londoners every year. Now, car manufacturers cannot afford to think about that. They have to, because of the rules of the system, because of the way it's set up, they have to think about selling the cars. So I might do very well if I'm a car salesman, but I'm not thinking about local communities and primary schools and children being affected by pollution. That's the system we live under, ladies and gentlemen, and it's essentially a psychopathic system. And now you may be very in your family life, not humane. Things like selling cars when there are too many cars in London already. Things like selling pesticides when we already have too many pesticides corrupting our food. You may be a decent person as a human being, but in your institutional role, you might be dominating society and actually causing more problems than you're solving. So I'd like to just draw attention to this in the context of climate change. I just said I was leading a demo. At 3 p.m. outside the Tate Modern, we're going to meet in March to City Hall to thank Sadiq Khan for declaring a climate emergency. That is a first step. When people come together, they can start to curtail the power of the state, the power of corporations. Remember, all these big companies, they exist at our pleasure. So for example, the East India Company, when it was set up in the 17th century by Queen Elizabeth, or before Queen Elizabeth, it existed primarily to serve what she considered the interests of the realm. That was a company specifically designed to serve the interests of England. BP should serve the interests of England. It should stop taking petroleum out of the ground. It should leave oil in the ground. It should start investing in things that actually will save us and our children from the disintegration of civilization, thanks to climate change. Otherwise, we're looking forward to a very bleak future. It's very simple.
Well, isn't Sadiq Khan responsible for all these stabbings that are happening in London? What's he done about that?
So no, actually the people... So the gentleman asked, is Sadiq Khan responsible for the stabbings in London?
He is.
No, actually the people doing the stabbings are responsible for the stabbings in London.
No.
Now, you can then ask, why did they get to that point in their life where they felt it necessary to stab someone in the heart, right?
Bad parenting.
In the street. You can ask questions about the factors that lead up to that. You can ask about gang culture and why gang culture seems very attractive to many people living in conditions of poverty. Why if you're living in a very isolated, fragmented community, being part of an accepted group of men that go around intimidating people and feeling strong, that might make you feel empowered. This is another big part of Extinction Rebellion, and my main interest is democratization. The United Kingdom doesn't have a democratized system.
That's true.
It still is a very monarchical kind of centralized, very highly centralized state. You're allowed to elect your masters every so often. You're allowed to elect your local commissioner if you want to for the police. But actually, that's not really that's not participatory. You might get to elect those who have a say, but you're not really having a say. And the sooner we actually have a say, the sooner this country will be a real democracy, and we'll have control over our lives and we'll be really adult human beings. The problem right now is that the British people, I think, are very submissive, and they're very awestruck by the state. All its pomp and ceremony, all of its tradition going back thousands of years, I think a lot of British people find that intimidating. So they choose to work within the narrower channels of Parliament and the electoral system. And they've even lost hope in many ways at this point. It's now just become a habit. So even someone like Jeremy Corbyn, who says we're coming out with a new politics, I mean, that's really wearing thin at this point. As much as I love Jeremy Corbyn and I'm going to vote for him, if there's another general election, as much as I think his form of politics is much more superior than Theresa May, the general establishment, the general framework is problematic. So we're allowed to debate, for example, whether or not we should respect the police. We're allowed to debate the merits of the European Union. We're allowed to debate, specific issues, but the general framework, the chessboard, is not questioned. The general framework of discussion is not, the political process is not really up for discussion, and that's a problem.
How would you change it to make it better?
Well, how would I change it? The movement, okay, two things. First of all, you do need to attend to the most serious symptoms. So climate change is the most serious symptom of the capitalist system, and that needs to be attended to very immediately. That's why I'm doing it. That's why I've planned a demo, and I'm going to be leading a demo on Tuesday.
I don't want to hear about your demos. I want to hear about how you would change
Now, my particular, well, you might, but other people might care about it. My particular movement that I'm interested in forming, our grand strategy would take us from very minimal demands to something much more radical and far-reaching. Because right now, like I said, the British people are, I think, they've been trained into submission for too long, and they need small victories first, I think. So one of the small parts of our program is to start having a 3-day work week. That would be somewhere along the middle of the campaign.
Okay,
3-day work week.
I got something
That would
I would
essentially
like
start to move us away from the wage slavery many of us live through now. And that would allow us more time to take part in our communities and build up and reduce crime, take part in maybe doing some self-policing as well. So instead of having to rely on policemen to keep things safe, to do a bit of your own, to be a bit more independent. Now, an even more basic demand is just simply to recognize forms of work that are not recognized. That's part of our minimum program, which is Guy Standing's Charter of Demands for Precarious Workers. Article 1 of the Charter. Article 1 is recognize all forms of work. There are many forms of work, especially done by women, which are not recognized in our economy. Especially unpaid work. Unpaid, it's often caring for elderly people, caring for young people, it can be caring for mentally ill people. It's not even just caring, it can be voluntary work in your local community, say like the Neighborhood Watch.
Okay, wait.
That kind of work is not
Let me just
recognized by the
address something
economy.
that this
Our
gentleman
economy
here
tends to
said.
focus on paid work.
Kyle.
Remember, that often is the very resource wasting kind of work. Like I mentioned, selling
let me
cars,
just address this.
that's not necessarily helping the society, is it? So we need to start recognizing forms of work that are not recognized.
Okay. But first, let's address the global warming. Let's address the pollution. Let's address the pollution first. Sorry. Sorry, bro, you'll talk.
If you want to give a long speech, you can get up.
No, it's not a long
If you want to say
speech.
something,
Okay, it's just to address what the gentleman said here. He was saying that capitalism promotes pollution when socialism can solve pollution. Now, I can give you one example, and you can't debunk it.
Really?
China.
China is a state capitalist country.
Okay,
China
sure,
is a state capitalist country. So
It's
don't
not a
use China.
capitalist country.
China is a state capitalist
even the
country.
Financial Times. Even the
It's
Financial Times
economically
is
capitalist. It's ideologically
It's a very,
communist.
very guided and centralized
It is.
capitalist
Now,
economy.
if you want me to
But
give
it's not
other
a- it's not
examples,
a
I can
secular-
give you the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had lots of industrialization going on that were polluting the state.
Yeah, the
If you
RLC.
want me to give you examples, there are other examples. But the main thing,
The Soviet Union was incredibly destructive to the Aral Sea. An entire gigantic lake, or it was actually a sea, in the Soviet Union.
I know, right?
It got completely drained to fund
not very helpful to
Can I
socialism,
answer
is
his
it?
question?
But that's
Not very
not-
helpful.
listen,
No, can
I'm
I
gonna-
answer his question?
You're not the speaker, so
No,
you're
but
not
he's making a slant.
No, he's
Well,
asking
like
me.
you answer.
This isn't slander, this isn't a court.
Go on,
so
go on.
just try and relax.
He's slandering the country.
This gentleman points out socialism. He says, oh, well, he says to me, Speaker, you're talking about capitalism and how that pollutes the environment through too much burning oil. But then he says, what about socialism? You're holding up socialism as a solution. Well, look at what the Chinese have done to the Yellow River, for example, by destroying the...
Look at their cities.
Yeah.
They
What
wear
if they-
masks
what-
all the time
what
because
about
they'll
the
die if
Soviet
they
Union?
don't.
When the Soviet Union was at the height of its power, draining all that water out the Aral Sea to feed crops of cotton, yeah? No, I'm gonna freely admit that I don't have a monopoly on the word socialism. I'm not going to dictate to you how you use that word. But I, for one thing, it's very, very inappropriate to describe the Soviet Union as socialist, or even a Soviet society. Soviet, if you look at what the Russian word Soviet means, it means workers' council, right? Now, almost as soon as Lenin came to power, he got rid of those workers' councils. he centralized power in the hands of the Bolshevik Party. Trotsky was a little bit more on the fence about whether or not to do this, but ultimately he went along with this and started reneging on his credentials as a revolutionary leader during the uprisings of 1917. Lenin very much betrayed workers' movements and even went so far as to crush an uprising in Kronstadt. There were many Ukrainian Makhnovist anarchists who were trying to create a truly free society, and Lenin took a step to crushing that. Now, if you define socialism as when the community runs the production, and the community decides who gets what, who makes what, and how it works, in a directly democratic sense, either through workers' councils or neighborhood councils, that's how you define socialism, and I think that's a more accurate definition.
Where has that been implemented?
Okay, but yeah,
Well, then
give
I'll
me
say
an
where that's
example.
been implemented. That's been implemented in Spain during the Spanish Civil War. That's been implemented in Ukraine very, very briefly. I'm not going to pretend these are permanent solutions and that they've lasted for a long time. But that's no argument. Just because a solution, an idea, no, the integrity of an idea is not determined by how well it's been put into practice. An idea can still be extremely good, even if it's not being massively put into practice. For example, the idea that women should have a vote and men should have a vote within a republican or constitutional monarchy framework. That idea, that for a long time was just an idea. I mean, around the time of Robert Peel was very much against it. The man who set up the police force. The man who set up the police force in Ireland and then later brought the idea into England, he was actually against the idea of women having the vote. But eventually he changed his mind and he realized, well, I don't think he changed his mind, but Britain changed its mind. You started to see in the early 20th century groundswell of support. Before New Zealand, no women had the vote. Before New Zealand, it was completely new. Right? But that doesn't denigrate the idea of women having the vote. And I will say the same about socialism, at least how I define it. Alright, so going back to your point about capitalism versus socialism. Socialism, as I define it, I think is a much more better alternative. And that's why I extend this idea to you all today to look into. The particular kind of socialism I believe in is called communalism, where neighborhood councils, neighborhood assemblies run the society. Where each of you are competent enough to actually run your own neighborhood, your own village, your own town. Through a direct face-to-face democracy. Face-to-face assembly. Okay, so every adult man and woman should have a say in how they run their society. They should have a say in how to manage public safety, how to manage the environment. That's real democracy.
Yeah, that's democracy, not socialism.
Now, the socialist element comes in with the economy. Remember, socialism is primarily an economic theory, not a political theory.
Not primarily,
If
it's
you take
both.
socialism and you implement it as a corollary to this neighborhood assembly movement, the communalist movement, you would have a municipalization of the economy. The economy would come under the hands of the local assembly. So take, for example, my neighborhood. I live in Earls Court, just about a 25-minute walk away from here. Now, the assembly for Earls Court would run the land and the buildings of Earls Court at the later stages. At first, they might only have a few shops or a few things. But as time goes on, they municipalize more and more of the economy. That, I think, is more democratic. Why shouldn't Londoners actually run London?
Because it'd be more brutal.
Why shouldn't Brummies actually run
It's just more
Birmingham?
brutal and it doesn't work.
So, what were you going to say?
Elaborate on the question.
What I was going to say was, I accept much of what you say. I don't come in those. I'm not going to. Are you?
Democracy is the same as what rule.
Earls Court is a great place.
I mean, there's plenty of opportunities in France.
I actually come from West Sussex, so we're going to declare where we come from. But what you say is the people that have sway and own much of the economy, the 7%.
0.1%.
Yeah, they own the most of the economy. They're not going to put up with your or my ideas.
This is why
they're going to fight it like hell.
This is why. Okay.
So will we have violence?
So this gentleman just asked me. He says to me, "Speaker, you want to?" Right? But then he says, what about the big businessmen, the tiny minority of people who control the economy currently? Well, this is why, ladies and gentlemen, we need a non-violent revolution, a non-violent struggle.
They have a habit of turning
Nice.
Revolutions are not inherently violent. For example, the 1905 revolution in Russia was actually predominantly a non-violent revolution.
So much destabilization, there was a revolution in 1917.
Now, we're talking here about the method. We're talking about the method. Thank you very much, Oliver. See you. Come back next week and get another speech. Oliver. My lad is always here. Okay, alright. Now this is why you need a direct confrontation. I think you do need to confront the state, confront capitalism, confront the businessmen, and actually show that you're not afraid. Show that you're not afraid of the state. This is why I was happy to get arrested on that bridge. I was happy to sit down There was a 55-year-old woman behind me I was linking arms with. Her daughter was about 18, I linked arms with, and another woman to my right, 2 friends of mine. I believe everyone was arrested, including me. I was arrested somewhere in the middle. But I'm proud to stand up to the state if I think it's for a good cause. If I think it's to protect the environment from the damage being done to it by big business. All right? I'm not some outside rebel coming from on the fringes. I think in many ways I'm a very mainstream person, just like many other British people, concerned about our families, concerned about our communities and our environment. We want to have a future to look forward to. We don't want to live in a wasteland. Like T.S. Eliot, if you've read T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, we'll get a good idea of what we might look forward to unless we deal with climate change. It'll first be a spiritual wasteland where we'll lose all hope, and then it'll be a real damage, like desert almost. That's the prospect. I will not stand by and look forward to that. I will stand up to the state. I will happily stand up and be arrested if I think it will serve that cause. That's the thing, you lose your fear. And there are many, this gentleman asked me, what are your strategies? And this relates to your point about standing up to big business, standing up to the state. Many people are afraid, because often they'll use the riot police. I know Boris Johnson recently sold the water cannon that was used because they didn't actually use it. That shows you how quiet. That shows you how quiet London is right now. They're barely using the water cannon. But there are many strategies you can use to deal with this. You can use many non-violent ways of standing up to the police. So, for example, if the police, like they did in Serbia, the police, Milosevic was trying to intimidate the students who wanted to get rid of him and create a democratic society. Milosevic got his riot police to stand in the town centre in Belgrade to bang their shields, like they did to the miners in the 80s. You can see that in Billy Elliot, if you watch the movie Billy Elliot. The police are banging their shields together to try and fight the miners. To try and shout, like the Zulus at Rorke's Drift. Like the Zulus at Rorke's Drift. They try and fight it, and they even chant. But I believe in the United States, the police actually chant. They do things to try and fight it. Now, there are many ways you can reduce the fear. Because naturally your body will tense up and you'll see that. But the Serbian students, they were very clever, they were very strategically sound. They studied Gandhi, they studied Martin Luther King, they studied previous non-violent strategies. So what they did was they got the very attractive women in their group to stand at the front.
Nice!
They didn't get them to take their clothes off, but they got them to stand at the front.
Now that's a good strategy.
That managed to calm the bitch down a little bit. Then what they did was, hold on, then what happened was they put a banner in front of the protesters, so the protesters couldn't actually see the police, so they weren't so scary. If you can't see it, you're less likely to be frightened. The other big strategy they used was drumming. So they made drumming, so much drumming, that no one could even hear the sound of the police banging their shields together. So all of this is there are all kinds of clever tactics and methods you can use to maintain discipline and make sure your protesters are very sort of disciplined. And whether you're standing up, it can be whether you're standing up to the Soviet Union, whether you're standing up to Milosevic, or in the case of my country, standing up to ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, in destroying our environment, destroying our communities through pollution and environmental destabilization. Wherever you are in the world, you can use these strategies. Wherever you are. It doesn't matter how oppressive. Because remember, everybody, power doesn't rest with the power holders necessarily. It actually ultimately rests with the people. If all of you here just now, sorry, it's rather like this ladder which I almost just fell off. It comes from underneath, right? And if I don't step on the ladder properly, I'm going to fall off. Or I don't have you to help me, which you just did, thank you. I'm going to fall off. Power comes from the people, it comes from below, holding up the structure.
Ladder is the people.
Well, it can be seen like that. So, there was something you wanted to ask about. I think he's gone now. You want to ask a question?
I always ask you about the EU.
About the EU.
Yeah.
We're going to have a question about the European Union. Go ahead.
Everyone's favourite topics. So, your utopia, should we say, right? Is that still a member of the EU? Because I know you're a supporter.
We need to transform the European Union from a neoliberal kind of almost neocon kind of institution that's essentially subservient to the United States. We need to transform it into an independent confederation of free citizens. There was a vision that Charles de Gaulle had in France. He had a vision of a European Union that would act as a third power between America and Russia. Now, I think that's a wise direction to go into. We need a European Union that's more independent. And now that Britain is out of the EU, or at least probably will be, we might actually see that more independent course taken, or have a counterbalance to America. One of the main priorities of British foreign policy should be to try and contain the United States. It's one of the leading terrorist countries in the world, one of the leading rogue states. It essentially ignores the United Nations. It's committed mass genocides repeatedly over the last century. Vietnam War,
It committed genocide when it made massive sanctions on Iraq that killed more than 500,000 children under 5 years old.
The European Union needs to be
the Iraq War itself
economic,
that was spearheaded
not
by George Bush.
not political.
Again, another example of mass genocide.
economic.
According to the Lancet, which is the leading medical journal in the United Kingdom, according to the Lancet, that war has killed more than 1 million people, more than 1 million Iraqis, 90% of them civilians, right? So we got to really think about what is Britain's role in the world? Are we going to get out of the way so that Europe can create its own independent course? Or if we do stay in the European Union, are we going to help it rather than bring it down through reactionary policies? Are we going to actually protect workers' rights, make the EU more democratic? That's what Yanis Varoufakis is trying to do in Greece. He's led a campaign called DM22 to try and transform the European Union into something more democratic. And this is coming from a country probably more tortured by the EU than any other country. The Greeks have been more kind of oppressed by the centralized German banks through being forced to pay back their loans when they don't have any money. They're being more oppressed than Britain by a long shot, right? And yet there are still many Greeks who are trying to transform the EU. That's a better message, I think, than just saying let's get out of it and do our own thing. We can't punch above our weight anymore. The empire it should be finished by now. We should accept that and become a more mature country.
Out of interest, God help me, I do not defend the American empire. It's falling to pieces anyway. Now, in fact, it's relative, all by comparison with most other empires, is relatively benign for certain reasons. The British Empire, out of interest for all of you people, killed 180 million.
When was it? What dates are we talking about?
From its inception and growth, from trading posts. And
so this gentleman just said 180 million people. That's not really surprising when you have an empire that goes over a quarter of the planet, and you are one of the leading perpetrators of genocide, along with America. You're going to create mass death. Well, the interesting thing is, we don't need to go on so much about 200 years ago. We can actually look at even more recent histories. So since, by one estimate, by the estimate of a British historian called Mark Persis, and other people like John Newsinger, other historians, the British government has been, since 1945, so just in the last 60 years or so, has killed more than 10 million people. And you can actually break it down very, very carefully. You can break down where those deaths come from. So collaboration with Colombian paramilitaries, deaths in Northern Ireland from collaboration with Protestant death squads. You can look at the bombing of Afghanistan, the bombing of Yugoslavia. You can look at the bombings of collaboration in the Nigerian Civil War. When Nigeria was having a civil war between the Biafran separatists and the Nigerian federal government, the British government was backing the Nigerian central government to suppress the Biafrans. Tens of thousands of people died. During apartheid civil war, the apartheid, another case where apartheid South Africa was invading other countries around southern Africa, stealing their uranium, causing mass death. British government was collaborating with them in that. The Malayan emergency, that's another very interesting conflict. That was essentially a war fought in the interest of the rubber industry. Britain had many rubber plantations in Malaya, which is the eastern part of Malaysia today. And there were, naturally, the Malayan Chinese who lived there wanted more representation. They wanted to get the British out and have their own country back, right? They wanted to create a new sort of arrangement that would favour them and their people more. But the British government was committed I think it was about 35,000 troops. And they use all kinds of grisly methods to stop these guerrilla fighters in the jungle. They used defoliation of crops, destroyed the crops through chemicals. They created what were essentially concentration camps, putting villagers into barbed wire settlements to keep them away from the guerrillas. I mean, they even, very interestingly, some generals even employed headhunters from Borneo. So they got tribal headhunters. They brought them over from Borneo. There's even a very harrowing picture in the Daily Worker, which is a communist newspaper in England at the time. There's a picture of a Royal Marine carrying the head of a Malayan communist, severed head of a Malayan communist, and that caused massive outcry. Because British people are very peaceful people for the most part. They get very horrified when they see things like, a British soldier cutting off heads.
Propaganda convey anything to you?
Sorry?
You've heard the word propaganda.
Of course, British society is one of the most propagandized. We invented propaganda during World War I. We essentially invented the modern form of propaganda, which the Americans perfected to create advertising, modern advertising. The British government during World War I, to mobilize the British public. Remember, it was actually a very very, very mixed war. Very significant sections of the society were against World War I. For example, many Christian religious groups completely against World War I. I myself acted in a play at my old university where I played a conscientious objector. The British government was so frightened of these conscientious objectors that they held secret courts in camera, they call it, in camera. Secret courts.
Do you know any quotes from the play?
Sorry?
Do you know any quotes from the play?
Well, there's a line where my character says, he's a postal clerk, he works at the post office. He says, he's about 25 years old, he says, I'm a proud Christian, I'm a proud socialist, I'm a moralist. He's a moralist. This is a language which is right here today. People standing up and saying they're proud of their moral beliefs. Nowadays, if I got up at Speaker's Corner and I started talking about my moral beliefs, people would start to think I was being sarcastic for the most part. We have such a cynical attitude to morality today. But that man was he had moral convictions, and he would not fight in World War I, which we very rightly perceived as an imperialist capitalist war, as David here has very rightly portrayed to us. World War I was essentially a conflict between empires that had gotten too big and that were fighting for each other's land because there was not enough land left to colonize. The Germans were invading British territory, taking over British territory, and essentially the British had to respond and build up their navy. And when they started to build up their navy, the Germans got frightened. They started to see one thing led to another. Imperialism is very much the background to World War I. And if we start to recognize that, we'll start to do a service to the memory of the people who died at the Somme. My great-grandfather, Andrew Scaradis, or Andrew Gerrard, if you want to anglicize it, he was an Afrikaner from South Africa. Not an Afrikaner, he was a Dutchman from South Africa. He fought in the Battle of the Somme. He was captured by the Germans at one point and held as a prisoner. And he had to try 3 times to escape before he managed to get out. He suffered in a ridiculous war that was essentially about imperial wealth in places like the Balkans, Africa and China. He was just a normal soldier who had absolutely no idea of what was actually going on. And if we start to really look at the history of it, we'll be doing a service to people like that. We'll be respecting the dead. If we actually look at the mistakes they made, figure out why they ended up where they were, start to really learn from history instead of making the same mistakes over and over again.
At the time, it was
right now, Britain is pursuing a very dangerous foreign policy in the Ukraine as well. I'm not going to go into that because that's a whole other speech. But I just want to finish on one thing. Please come to my demo. Please come to my demo. It'll be the 18th of December, this Tuesday. It's about 48 hours from now. We'll be meeting at 3 p.m. outside the Tate Modern. We're going to march to City Hall to support Mayor Sadiq Khan's decision to declare a climate emergency. You may disagree with Sadiq Khan on many other issues, but that decision is a very right decision to declare a climate emergency. So that'll be the demo on Tuesday. I also invite you to have a look at British history really closely. Or if you're French, to look at French history. If you're American, to look at your country's history. Don't just accept the official narratives. There's an official narrative, which especially people of these men's generation. There's an official narrative which says that the British Empire was better than other empires. We were better than the French Empire. We were better than the Belgians and the Germans and the Portuguese. We treated them with more human rights, more respect. That's the official narrative. But that's a wrong narrative. It's wrong. The facts are very different. If you look at the National Archives, if you look at history, you'll have a much more accurate picture. In many ways, it was significantly worse than other empires because of the extent of the reach. It's just sheer extent. For example, I mean, the fact as well is that it's so secretive. It's so secretive. You know that, for example, MI5 and GCHQ have actually released a few documents about what's going on.
Yeah,
10 years time.
That's the period it's kind of talking about.
Don't feel the wet race is about that.
Centric side.
Yeah, but my point is that this hat is a symbol for a group of people.
For you?
No, not for me.
For you?
If you allow me to speak,
come on this side more.
If you allow me to speak, you're going to understand what I'm going to say. Otherwise, you're not going to understand, are you?
Oh no, I understand what you think of it. But for other people...
Alright, you can speak to him. You're not even let me speak. Anyway, my point here is those people who are behind this idea of make Britain great again. It's the same thing. Meaning that let us get rid of the immigrants. That's what it means.
I don't think so.
Yeah, that's what it means.
Islamic.
Yeah.
Well,
I don't want to make it
I'm
answer your questions. I'm American.
Legal immigration.
Don't be angry, man.
Legal
What's your name?
Gerson.
Huh?
Gerson. The name of the son of Moses.
Okay, good. South American, man.
Yes.
Yeah, so my point here is clearly there are, I guess, the illegal immigrants, you know.
Well, illegal immigrants, you said it yourself.
I'm saying, and I guess, no, but okay, who destroyed Iraq?
Huh?
Who destroyed Iraq?
How is that relevant to the
I'll
topic?
tell you how it's relevant. If any Iraqi has a right to live in Britain and he has a right to live in America.
No, he does.
Well, I'll tell you why. Logic dictates, if I come to you and destroy your house, and you come to stay in my house, what logic dictates? I should allow you because I destroy your house. You never asked me to come and destroy your house. American and the British, both of them.
I didn't agree with both of the wars.
Yeah,
If
but
you're talking about wars, I mean, we agree on this. I mean, I didn't
that's what I'm saying.
agree with
So,
wars,
every Iraqi,
Yeah.
woman and man and a child has a right to live in Britain and America because America and Britain, both of them, as Gordon Brown in the interview with the Channel 4 or ITV1, he said that clearly the American knew that Saddam never had a nuclear weapon. So also, let me speak. Let me finish. So Tony Blair likewise. So they destroy people's country, and this is the problem with the white supremacists. They think they can destroy people's country, they can enslave people, they can go to people's countries and impose their way, and impose their culture. But they think no one has a right to come and live in their country. So what do you think what I said?
Why'd you put race
I can't
to
speak
it?
to 10 people at the same time. American, come on, man. South America, come on. Now, you can't speak to. My point here is, would you not agree with me that every Iraqi has a right to live in Britain and America?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much. That's my point. You see what I'm saying? Likewise, every Egyptian.
Oh, I don't think so.
Likewise, every African.
Okay, let me say one second. So I think I believe in legal immigration. Okay, there's two types of people I want in terms of legal immigration. Okay, I want people who are going to work essentially like. Sorry, Donald. So I want, I want kind of low-income labourers. They're great immigrants. I want those to come through who are prepared to work. I want those.
And the country.
And the other one is I want highly educated foreigners. People like doctors, engineers, these kind of things. They're the two kinds of legal immigrants that I personally advocate for. And I'm all down for that. I don't care what race you are.
But when the
yeah, can I just
sorry, of course.
Okay, but there's a certain type of immigrants that I want. People, who are going to prepared to work and prepared to bring over high-value skills. They're the two immigrants I want. Outside of that, not for me.
Okay, thank you very much for your information. But are you aware that when the Americans and the British went to people's countries, they never chose people with higher education and the people who was going to have the country? When the French and Americans and the British, they went to Algeria, they didn't bring people who had the high education or people who's going to have Algeria. They brought people who's going to destroy Algeria. They brought people who's going to destroy Iraq. They brought people who's going to destroy Egypt. So logic dictates you should be the last person to dictate which people should come to your country. Because when you came to their country...
Yeah, I don't like the foundations of that.